John Wyatt, who is coming to speak to us today, has written this wonderful book that I'm going to have to put in front of myself in order to show you, called The Final Lap, which is all about life as a Christian from retirement right up until the end of life. It's a really short book, but it's packed full of so much knowledge and wisdom. I'm just going to read something from the introduction here that I think really sets up our time together well today, but also serves to really explain what the book is about. It says, each one of us has an individual course marked out for us. We don't choose our own path, we are given it. What's more, we're not alone. It's a group race. We are all in this together, and we're here to encourage one another, strengthen one another, support, and even carry one another along when we need to. There's a great crowd of unseen witnesses all around us, watching us and cheering us on. I think that's a wonderful reminder. I'm gonna pray in a second and then introduce John. But before I do that, the subject that we're talking about today can be very heavy, and we will be covering some things that are potentially going to be difficult. And so if that's the case for you, that's absolutely fine. But if you would like some pastoral support, we'd love to hear from you. If you don't quite know who to go to, we'll help to try and find somebody to put you in touch with, so that you can have that support if needed, and we will definitely be praying for you. So please do keep that in mind throughout the session. So let me just pray, and then I'll welcome John. Lord, I want to thank you that you have designed us as our creator to be dependent, firstly on you, but then on one another, that as the body of Christ here on earth, you have given us varying gifts and abilities, and those gifts are meant to support one another. I want to thank you that we're not in this alone, and that your church spread around the globe and throughout history and into the future is not the effort of any one person. I pray that you would bless our time together tonight, bless John as he speaks. And I pray this in your mighty name. Amen. So John is an esteemed author, speaker, and Faith and Later Life ambassador, as well as an emeritus professor at University College London. John's faith saturates everything he does, and as a result of that, John has dedicated his retired years to scrutinizing the ethical and philosophical challenges posed by technological advancements, as well as the shifting sands of the culture in which we live. John's writings and podcasts are available on his website and cater to both academic and lay readers, exploring various contemporary issues. John is here to speak to us today about how each of us are designed by God to be dependent on him and on one another. Thank you so much for being with us, John.
Thanks very much, Adsum, and hello, everybody. It's great to be sharing in this event together. I spent most of my life working as a baby doctor, caring for some incredibly tiny and vulnerable little babies, some of them extremely premature babies, going right down to weighing a pound in weight, 500 grams, and literally fitting in the palm of my hand. And as I've spent so many hours of my life caring for some of these incredibly fragile and precious little babies, it made me reflect repeatedly on the mystery of what it means to be human, and the fact that we start our lives so utterly fragile and dependent on other people. And it's really thinking about these issues which has increasingly made me convicted and convinced that dependence is part of the way we are being designed by our loving creator. You know, we live in an age which is obsessed by independence, by the right to live our own lives, the freedom to choose our own paths and live out our own choices. You know, like that corny old song of Frank Sinatra, I did it my way. Philosophers call this the principle of autonomy, a Greek word, autonomos, which literally means I make my own rules, I make my own laws. And autonomy is praised by many thinkers as being what life is all about. It's all about living your own life, making your own choices, making it up as you go along. And, I've just hit 70, 70 and 10. So feel, as perhaps many people do on this call, like, I'm coming to the end of my particular race. I'm looking to see what this next phase is going to be like. And you've probably, like me, seen some of those images of what old age is supposed to be like in the adverts. Those elderly people, they all seem to have incredibly athletic bodies. They're running marathons, or they're sitting drinking wine, staring at the sunset, as this kind of glamorous, wonderful vision of what old age should be. But of course, it's a myth. For most of us, life is not at all like that. And it's this idea that it's all about living your own life, making your own choices. It's a very powerful but a misleading myth. For many modern people, the prospect of losing their choice, of losing autonomy, and of becoming dependent on other people, that's one of the most frightening things that they can conceive. And one of the things I'm aware of is that part of the push towards the legalization of some kind of mercy killing or assisted suicide, part of that is being driven by people's fear of becoming dependent. Perhaps it'd be better to die rather than to become dependent on others. Now, it'd be nice to say, of course, Christian believers are quite different from all that, but I'm afraid it isn't true. I know a number of older Christian believers who said something like to me, I'm very happy to care for other people. I'm very happy to look after other people. But if I ever get to the point where I become a burden on somebody else, and where somebody else has to look after me, then I'm going to say to God, thank you very much. I've had my life. It's time to go to heaven now. Goodbye. And so actually the fear of becoming dependent, I think, is actually very common amongst all of us. But this is where what the Christian faith has to teach us is something that's profoundly countercultural. That dependence is part of the design. It's part of the way that God has created us. And our good creator has created us in a good way. Dependence is not an evil, subhuman, dehumanizing thing. So God chose to take his precious image, this reflection of his being, the image of God, he chose to place it in a fragile, pathetic, carbon-based life form. And in the second chapter of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 2, the text says that Adam, the first human being, was created from the dust of the ground. In fact, the Hebrew for the word for human, Adam, is taken from Adamah, which is the Hebrew word for ground. So in the literal Hebrew, human beings are described as groundlings. That's what we are. We're made out of the dust of the earth. And if you think about that, that means that human beings are designed to be frail, to be vulnerable, to be fragile, and to be dependent on others. And that's why God, even before the fall, says it's not good for Adam to be alone. He needed companionship and a helper, not because he was fallen and corrupted by sin. No, it was because he was fully human, as God intended. And if you think about it, surely God could have chosen to make us in a different way. He could have chosen to make us wonderful and glorious and dynamic and resilient. I mean, think of the angelic beings, the seraphim in the temple, when Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, had that vision of the temple, and the seraphim are crying, holy, holy, holy. And the entire temple is shaking at the sound of their voices. God could have created us like that, glorious and radiant and powerful. But instead, in his sovereign choice, he chooses to make us and create us vulnerable and fragile and dependent. And so not only we're designed to depend on God himself as our Father, we're also designed to depend on one another. You know, you and I came into the world locked into a network of relationships made interdependent. And we were locked into a network of relationships with people that we didn't choose, with a mother and a father, with grandparents and siblings and aunts and uncles and friends and carers. And if like me, you were born into a Christian family and into a Christian church community, then I too was born with Christian aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and people who loved me and cared for me. And in Christian thinking, that was not some bizarre kind of fluke. No, it's an essential part of what it means to be human. We come into the world as helpless beings, totally dependent on one another's love and care. And if you think about it, the very fact that you're sitting there, and I can see on the screen that most of you are looking pretty together, what that tells me is that when you were born, somebody loved you, somebody cared for you, somebody washed you, somebody fed you, somebody kept you warm, somebody wiped your bottom, because you couldn't do anything for yourself. And so we come into this world utterly and totally helpless. And then we go through a phase of our life. We continue dependent all throughout our lives. But as we go through our adult lives, other people become dependent on us, and we care for them, and we wash them, and we feed them, and we pay for them, and we look after them. But you know, most of us are going to end our lives utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And this is not a terrible or degrading or inhuman kind of reality. No, it's all part of the design. It's part of the narrative of a human life. And this was brought home to me a number of years in an incident which I've spoken about several times and written about. My mother, who was a lovely, vivacious Christian lady, a nursery school teacher, and someone who cared for so many other people, she was struck down towards the end of her life by a rapidly advancing kind of dementia. And she, in front of our eyes, she was transformed. She became utterly dependent on others. She was confused. She was hallucinating. She required 24-hour nursing care. And I used to go and see her from time to time. And near the end, I was visiting her, and somebody thrust a yogurt pot and a teaspoon into my hand. And I was trying to feed her and holding the spoon and saying, open your mouth, here it comes, open your mouth. And then I suddenly had a flashback. This was exactly how she used to feed me. In fact, I even had a sort of memory of the spoon going into my mouth and the finger coming out and wiping my face. And now the tables were turned, and I was trying to feed my mother. And I remember at the time this quite strong sensation that came into my mind. You know, this is the way it was meant to be. I was learning more of what it meant to be a son, and she was learning more of what it meant to be a mother, because dependence is part of the story. It's part of the lives that God has given us. And this is not a terrible, undignified, dehumanizing thing. It's part of the strange symmetry of our lives. Our parents love and care for us at the beginning, and then we love and care for them at the end. We're created to be bonded together in lives of interdependence, of mutual dependence. And God places us in biological families, but for those of us who are Christians and part of a Christian community, he places us in Christian families as well, with Christians, brothers and sisters, and aunts and uncles, and mothers and fathers. And so if you ever hear someone say to you, I just don't want to be a burden to other people, or even if you're tempted to think it yourself, I think, you know, you should respond, you know, you're wrong. I was created to be a burden for you, and you were created to be a burden for me. And the life that God has given us is one of mutual burdensomeness. And of course, that's why Paul in the letter to Galatians says, bear one another's burdens. The literal Greek is weight, bear the weight of one another. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. And, you know, as we face the challenges of an aging population and all that might involve, this is going to be a real challenge for us as a Christian community. Can we live in a way in which we genuinely support one another and which we carry one another's burdens? And I know that genuine practical caring is tough. It's hard and it's challenging. We can't sentimentalize what practical caring involves. And I know that many, many older people continue to worry about the possibility of them becoming dependent in the future. Many people, including people who have a strong Christian faith, have deep anxieties about what the future might hold and how they would get on if they were unable to look after themselves. And although they know in theory they should be prepared to accept becoming dependent on others, they're painfully aware, we all are, of how our health and social services and care and support networks are often overstretched and inadequate. So I think we need to think about these issues and discuss them openly in advance with our loved ones, with our friends, and with professionals who can advise us about the options. And perhaps if you're a carer and you're caring for older relatives, you can be asking them the question, where would you like to be looked after in the future? What would be the best arrangement for your care? What are you most worried about as we look to the future? How can we plan ahead? Of course, I understand that these conversations can be very painful and embarrassing, but it's surely much better to discuss these things openly with our loved ones before the crisis strikes. And yet it's, God doesn't just create us in this fragile, vulnerable way. Something even more amazing and wonderful happens, because God himself, the God of total power and authority, the God who created and sustains the universe, he himself chooses to turn himself into a human baby in the person of Jesus. And he needs to be cared for, and he needs to be fed, and he needs to have his bottom wiped, and he is utterly and totally dependent on others. I think we're so familiar with the Christmas story, with the nativity scenes, with Bethlehem, with those cherubs on Christmas in carols and Christmas cards and so on, that we've forgotten how utterly scandalous the Christmas story is, that God himself chooses to turn himself into a real human baby, a baby that has to be fed and kept warm, and who vomits down his mother's front, and who needs to have his bottom wiped. Really? And yet that's what the Christian faith is teaching us. And yet what we learn is that even in that moment of total dependence, Christ's divine status, his dignity as the only begotten Son of the Father, was in no way impaired or demeaned by his dependence. Even as he's in that nativity, in that manger in Bethlehem, he is upholding the universe by the word of his power. And so there's a vitally important lesson for us here, isn't it? Even if we become dependent, even if you or I end up in a hospital bed and we can do nothing for ourselves, and we need to be washed, and we need to be fed, and we need to be cared for, and we need to have our bottoms wiped, our unique dignity and status as a beloved princess or prince of the Most High is in no way touched, because Jesus has been there before. In fact, in some sense, there's no experience that you can have as a human being, which in some sense God himself hasn't gone before, because it wasn't just at the beginning of his life that he experienced total dependence. Think of him on the cross with his arms stretched out, and the God of total power and total authority says through parched lips, I am thirsty. In other words, he can do nothing for himself. He is utterly dependent. And so As somebody said it, there's nothing that can happen in our lives that God himself, in the person of Jesus, hasn't already been there. He was with us in the darkness of the womb, as he will be with us in the darkness of the tomb. He's walking alongside us, even in those experiences of pain and suffering. Now, of course, we mustn't sentimentalize or romanticize the experience of dependence, because the reality of depending on others can be distressing. It can feel painful, even humiliating. I know this personally. Some years ago, I developed a very severe psychiatric illness, and I ended up in a locked hospital ward. And in my depression, I became convinced that my whole life, my professional work, everything that I had labored for was destroyed. And it was a terrible experience, a kind of personal hell. And I too became utterly dependent on others. My mind was completely affected. I couldn't even look after myself. And if you had talked to me at that time about God, to be honest, God was just a word with 3 letters. It meant absolutely nothing. But the one thing that could penetrate through into my own personal agony was the love of human beings. It was the fact that my wife loved me, that she came and she cared and she put her arms around me. And one of my very best friends came and tracked me down in this locked psychiatric ward. And I was just moved to tears by the fact that human beings cared about me. And it took a long time, as in the process of recovery, I became increasingly aware that actually God was reaching out to me in that ward, but he was reaching out to me in a human form. He was reaching out to me through human beings. And that's true, isn't it? Because we are made out of dust, because we are human beings, we need to hear human words spoken to us, words of comfort. We need to have human arms around us. And therefore, those of us who are carers have this amazing privilege of expressing God's love, of being God, of being the person of Jesus to those who are suffering, to those who are dependent. So it took many years for that healing and recovery process to occur in my life. But with that slow recovery, I gradually came to realize that that whole experience of dependence and humiliation was also a kind of strange gift. God had given me this gift, a painful gift, but also a gift that I could use to try to help others with their own struggles and as they face dependence. And just as Paul prayed for a thorn in the flesh to be taken away, and just as for him, so for me, Jesus said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So as we approach a period when we become dependent on others, we need to see that despite the fact that this can be painful and suffering, there may be suffering involved, this can be part of God's calling on our lives. John Dunlop, a Christian physician, wrote, "There is an essential humility that makes us willing to be served." Christians should have learned at the time of their salvation that they can do nothing to save themselves, but are totally dependent on God. And sometimes a desire for self-sufficiency can impair spiritual growth. And at the end of our lives, it's good to be less self-sufficient and trust God more fully. So those are very deep and countercultural words. A desire for self-sufficiency, to do it my way, can actually impair our spiritual growth. And as we come to the end of our lives, we need to learn more about what it means to depend so that we can grow. Because it's not all loss. As we come to greater dependence, that can open up new avenues, new ways of understanding God, new avenues of service, new ways of being available for others, new ways of expressing gratitude, of prayerfulness, of passing on life wisdom, of showing that we care for others, of leaving a spiritual legacy. I think many people can testify to the fact that dependence can open new avenues for service, new avenues and ways of learning more about what it means to be human. And we can provide positive models of letting go. Instead of hanging on desperately, clinging on to everything that we have as an independent person, what we need to learn more about is how to let go gracefully, how to hand over to others responsibility and not cling on to everything for ourselves. And as the Apostle Paul reminds us, we don't lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed. For our light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory as we look not to the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. The things that are seen are transient. The things that are unseen are eternal. You know, in secular thinking and in medical thinking, life starts from nothing. You start at this tiny little embryo, and then you develop, and you're born, and you're learning new things, and your brain's getting bigger, and you're making more connections, and everything's getting better and stronger, and then you hit 25. And then from 25 onwards, you're on the long, slow downhill decline. And bit by bit, your cells are starting to die, and your DNA is accumulating errors, and your cellular machinery is clogging up. And to begin with, you can't see the damage. But then as you get older and older, the damage becomes more and more obvious, and your body decays. And then eventually, it all grinds to a halt, and then you die. And that's a secular understanding of life. But in Christian thinking, it's completely different. In Christian thinking, as there's a wonderful verse in Proverbs 4 that says, the path of the righteous is like the first gleam of dawn that grows into the everlasting day. And so our Christian life starts with us seeing that first gleam of dawn, but the promise is that it's going to grow and grow and grow into the everlasting day. So may God give us that hope as we face the challenges of dependence at the end of life. May we learn to focus our eyes on the first gleam of dawn and on the hope that goes beyond the grave. Thanks everybody for listening.